Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry.
I'm Amy Poppinga.
And we are back with our pre-exam one webisode.
We are, yes, and it is early. It is. We are up bright and early to try to, because we were excited.
That's right.
About the exam.
Nothing like talking exam, right?
Nothing like talking exam. Yeah.
All right, so our first question, before we get to the exam, and we will talk about it, on our last worksheet, we asked students to talk about two early Christian debates over canon, over theology. I mean, a lot of the early church is about how do we sort out orthodoxy? How do we define orthodoxy and heresy? So talk about some things that were significant to them. As you think about early church debates, what do you think is most important to us today in terms of some of those early church controversies? Which ones jump out to you?
Yeah, for me, actually, it really does go back to what, it's hard because I feel like on the one hand, obviously, I should say, well, it's the nature of the Trinity. It has to do with like the nature of Jesus's created versus Jesus's having always existed. And yet at the same time, I will say that I grew up in a Christian home. I went to Christian school for almost all of my life. And it was not until college that I had any awareness of the fact that like the books in the Bible were decided by a group of people who came together, had debate, and only certain voices would be heard. Certain things were put in, certain things were kept out. What's the rhyme or reason for that? Nobody left a rubric buried anywhere that we've been able to find. And so for me, that actually does really matter, because being a historian and thinking about studying context, understanding what other kind of cultural debates were happening at the time, understanding issues of power, who had authority, who was at the table, that has really made me think about, okay, well, here's what we have. Here is what was decided. Here is what we revere as canon. Here's what we hold up as the Word of God. For me, it really does kind of matter in terms of how I think in general about the importance of Scripture. Well, I shouldn't say the importance, because I believe Scripture is important, but like, how do we deal with issues of interpretation when I don't really know what was happening behind the scenes? Like, that is something, I don't think about that on a daily basis. Like, I don't know, reading something in Timothy and then thinking to myself, well, but at the same time, it does matter. And so I think that it's important to not be completely freaked out by that. It doesn't mean you throw everything out. However, I do think that, for me, it really makes me think about some of those bigger issues of what's often missing when we just are looking at the surface level and not really thinking about sort of the stories behind it, like whose voices are left out, who just made everybody mad and got shut out. So for me, that kind of is the biggest one. Mm-hmm. I don't know, because I guess in some way maybe that's the heart of then what gets at the other questions in terms of being tied to theological.
Right. It defines the authority we're going to look to
right.
for all those other things.
So then all those other questions.
For me, I look at those two debates that we looked at the very end of this unit with Augustine, and I'll pick out the Donatists, for example, as one that's really crucial to me, because one of the core ideas to Christianity, especially to me as I think about my own sort of faith journey, is the idea of the fact that we as human beings are broken and imperfect, mm-hmm. right? And both the Donatist controversy and the debate with Pelagius, Augustine is kind of pushing for that, saying like if
this won't work.
If we rest this on us, this falls apart. So it opens the door up for the most powerful idea, which is grace. The idea of grace is it becomes necessary in the debate with Pelagius. It becomes necessary in the debate with the Donatists.
Which is radically countercultural and is in a way, counterfactual to the way humans, I think, understand fact. I'm thinking of last week when we had our rigorous debate about Plato versus Aristotle, and you think of how, you and I brought up the idea of like, how does that work when it comes into something like faith? And we talked about how does that work when you're trying to define the truth of what love means? And so for me, it raises the question of, well, what is the truth of something like forgiveness or atonement or, to your point, if left to my own devices, I'm doomed. I do believe that. So that is an incredibly important question, because again, I don't know. It's a paradox, because on the one hand, exactly what seems sort of radically unbelievable is exactly what makes it believable, because if you believe that it's based upon, your good works or what you know, then like forget it.
Right. And what's crazy is you have in some of these debates and writing this theology, you have literal genius level human beings saying, I am broken. I am
right.
Augustine. I mean, Augustine is by any account a genius.
Yes.
And he is saying, but I'm not perfect, and if it's left to me, I'm a sinner. That's going to fall.
And that's one of the things. I mean, this is off topic, I guess, but one of the things that I like so much about Augustine is just always operating from this place of being having a very troubled nature. And the comfort I think that one can find in that is that he is brilliant, and he is operating on a whole other level than a lot of us, certainly myself. But at the same time, that doesn't mean everything is figured out or that everything in life is peaceful. And that's exactly actually what's sort of driving him, right, to his conclusions is all of this, and yet I can't live with myself, really.
Right.
You know?
So probably, I mean, one of the biggest, most consequential debates, or at least decisions that gets made, is the Council of Nicaea. The Nicene Creed is for a lot of churches, is the beginning of the definition of, well, what does it mean to be a Christian? Right. It's like, well, Nicene Creed sort of lays that out.
Like, how do we put words to it? Mm-hmm.
So what I want to hear you talk about a little bit is the resolution of that. Because that is, I mean, you talked a little bit about kind of the problematic nature about how these things get resolved. The Council of Nicaea is called by the Emperor Constantine. Yeah. And remind me, what was his position in the church? What was his job in the church?
He didn't have one.
Nothing, right? So he calls the church council. Yeah. He's there. I mean, he enforces the orthodoxy that comes out of it. Like, how does that make you feel when we're sitting here 1700 years later, and maybe one of the most important definitions of Christianity, Christian belief, comes out of those circumstances?
No, well, I mean, again, you know, okay, I think that I always want to acknowledge that if I get to sit here and sort of find it problematic or take issue with it, that's partially because I'm operating from a position of privilege, right? Because at the end of the day, for me, white woman, Christian living in America, me living out my beliefs, for myself, I will just say, and maybe this is a problem in and of itself, isn't really difficult. I mean, I'm not going to be labeled a heretic. I am not going to be, blackballed or ostracized. For me, also as a woman, it is hard sometimes. And this is something that, it's not just a thing female scholars talk about. It's certainly male scholars talk about it as well, but there is something really interesting about practicing a discipline where you're constantly saying, well, we all say, what would it have been like to live in this setting? What would it have been like to be me living in this environment? I mean, we ask students to do that, right? We're like, what would you have thought? And it is weird sometimes to think to yourself, I wouldn't have mattered. Like, I wouldn't have mattered. I wouldn't have had any kind of a voice. I wouldn't have been seen as any kind of an authority. Yet at the same time, that's one of the valuable things about looking at early church history is that women actually did have a voice and women actually were valued before the system became systematized. So for me, what's problematic about the Council of Nicaea, what's problematic about like the hard definitions that come out of that, even if I agree with them, are the ways in which I get nervous when we have measures by which we say, if people don't believe this, if people don't do this, if people don't affirm this, then we are the ones that condemn them, and that we believe we have the authority of God to do that work of the condemning. And I think that becomes particularly dangerous when it is sort of whether it's created by, even if it's just condoned by, but when there's sort of a top-down hierarchical from the government type of either like condonement of that type of system. I mean, to me, it's one of the issues with the separation of church and state and why I think separation of church and state is a good thing. Does that mean then that we elevate Constantine as this sort of like ideal Christian? We don't even know if he was a Christian. And so it's interesting how hard we have to work against certain historical assumptions. And it's like, no matter what we do, those assumptions get made because of like specific moments in history. So the fact that he called this council and that he has this role in it, we automatically start to ascribe to him things we actually have no idea of.
So what would you say to a student who was concerned about the fact that a lot of Christianity rests on this statement of faith?
Well, gosh, Sam, that's a huge question. Well, I would say that's why, that's the beauty of learning more about your faith. Like, you can't be afraid of those things, but I think it's important to engage them. And it is important to say, what do creeds mean to me? I'm going to sound really hypocritical because the next thing I'm going to say is, I actually kind of really like the idea of creeds. As I have become older and as I have become exposed to various different denominations, faith expressions, seen the issues within them, I've actually really felt a comfort in being tied more to historical expressions of Christianity and looking at the way that people, in order to solidify something and to move it forward, often turn to creedal statements or things like councils to say, this is part of making sure that this lasts. This is part of making sure that we are creating a future, that we're offering insurance to a future. Right. And I think it's necessary on the one hand, but it's also equally problematic.
Yeah. I think I like that idea of sort of finding comfort in creeds, because maybe some of you students don't think about it that way. In the same way, travel is powerful because you're walking in the footsteps.
It's also upsetting. And I
was going to say, in the same way, travel is powerful, and then you're walking in the footsteps of, if you're doing historical kind of travel, right?
Yeah.
When you do something like recite the creeds, you are praying along with 1,700 years. It's the same prayer.
Yeah.
So that's powerful. Another thing, and this is probably trite, but it's a thing to think about if you feel deeply troubled by the Council of Nicaea. One of the things, I remember I had a student a long time ago who was, and I was kind of like you, like, well, okay, you're trying to explain it. And another way to think about it is that you can look at it and say, well, maybe it's a deep problem that the church has a lot of foundations in this statement which came about through all this political stuff. Or you can say, isn't it miraculous that the truth won through despite think of all the things that could have gone wrong, but you look at the creeds and it's like, the creeds are pretty solid, actually.
Yes.
So, that's another way to read that if you want to think about if God's really working in the world, maybe that's one of the things God is.
Well, and it's a beginning. Well, it's not the beginning of it. It was kind of in the middle, but it's a reminder to us that Christian history is a living thing. I guess it depends upon one's viewpoint of the way God works in the world and the way one thinks about history. I think of God as working in the world as active today as he is in the past, as he is in the future that we can't see. And I think we're called to that, continual working out. The continual working out of what does this mean for now? What does it mean for our context? And so, but there's markers along the way, and those creeds certainly stand out as a significant point of a marker, saying, here it's a here I stand type of moment. Right. And there was a need to say, this has become so many different things. People are saying so many different things. How do we make and it was distinguishing itself from the culture, right? It was saying, here's what this religion means in contrast to syncretism and other types of religion and state religions that existed at the worship of gods and things like that. So it was drawing a distinction, which is important.
Right, to move from thinking about controversies there to maybe more contemporary controversies, maybe not the right word, but an interesting thing to think about. The day after the exam is what holiday?
It is the 4th of July.
Right, the most patriotic holiday in America, right? How would Augustine feel about, if we're thinking about this idea of Christians and their relationship to the state? We read excerpts from City of God where Augustine's trying to think about, how do we live in the empire and be Christians? How do we think about that relationship? If you were to ponder Augustine at your 4th of July barbecue, or if you were to invite him to your 4th of July barbecue, what do you think?
He brings the coleslaw. The way you're a historian is if no matter what you're studying, you say to yourself, this is so relevant for now. That is just being a historian, right? Because you start to realize that you are always. Whether it was 1999 or whether now it's 2018, I find myself thinking that all the time. And then I realize, that's just probably, trained historical thinking. But I think it's an incredible question for right now as we look at our current sort of American body politic, as we look at the division, as we look at, I think in times of crisis, people want to put I'm not even going to say faith, I'm going to say they want to look to belief, and they want their belief to be in something that provides them with security. And that's a significant question, during Augustine's time as the Roman Empire is crumbling, and this thing that we still to this day, again, historical kind of reframing, hold up as this just, right? End all be all of what a society can be, what an empire can be. And yet we don't seem to sometimes remember we're doing that in a nostalgic hindsight kind of a way, not what Rome is today or what Rome represents today. And so what's fascinating to me about it and about Augustine is that he's really, again, he's wrestling. Like, he's living in the midst of a society that is falling apart, and so begins to challenge the idea of what do you do when you have sort of put your hope and in things that you believed to be true or that you believe to be stable. And thus, then, when those crumble or when those become insecure or unstable,
or show themselves to be the human institutions they are,
no, now it becomes a question about faith. Like, now we realize that at the end of the day, what we have is faith, and faith is a very different thing to me than belief is. Like, I do think those are two distinct words and two distinct things that kind of happen to us when we think about, like, where do we place our security? And so I think Augustine would be like, woe to you people, like look around. And I think that would be a particular imperative for at my all Christian 4th of July barbecue, which is really important to us, but that he would say, I think you have put way too much security in human systems. Like, is that really what Scripture is teaching you? Is that really what Christ was teaching you? Was that your route? Or even, I would say, number one, is our chief job to make ourselves secure? Like, is our chief job to create our own safety and to say, my number one, like, calling as a Christian is to make myself as safe as I can be. That actually I find, and I certainly long for safety and security, but that is something I actually feel quite a conviction about, is my whole frame of how I think about our country, how I think about legislation, how I think about even my own community, how much of that is motivated by my own fear of, like, losing what I have. So I think that Augustine would be a bit of a downer at the 4th of July picnic, because I think he would be walking, right, like,
At the same time, it's important to also remember that Augustine isn't a complete rejecter of the empire. Well, at the same time,
but he's saying, he's saying you need that tension, stability, but at the same time, at the end of the day, where's your faith going to lie if that stability should crumble? Like, will it collapse? Like, what type of language do you use when you're talking about the way you view what's happening in the world in relation to what you believe God is doing? And if you believe that, like, everything, quote, stable, secure, protected that you see in life is the result of, like, God having control of it, then you better be prepared for how you're going to theologically reframe when bad things happen to you, either individually or on a broader societal level.
So we've had students doing a lot of writing. The test is coming up. There's some writing on the test. As you think about what students have written so far, we talked in our last week, we talked about sort of our observations after a first writing assignment. Now that we've seen a little bit more, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've been pleased. First of all, I think to reiterate things we've said before, the number one piece of advice is follow the feedback. I think we all try to not just say, good job, or you can do better, but to be specific about, you need to use examples. You need to use specific examples. Please use quotes. But when you're using quotes are necessary when you're saying something that really needs to be in the author's voice, not quotes that are descriptive or quotes that are things that you could take care of yourself.
And you can, I'm going to add to that, you can quote an idea.
Sure.
Like that. You don't always have to be like, well, here's exactly where they said it, but you can talk about reference. In the essay when she talks about this, and this, like that's right. This has the same effectiveness as actually dropping a block quote in there.
No. And really thinking about utilizing the content as a whole. I want to see that you don't need to be like, as I saw in the film, fill in the blank. I know the films. I know the museums. I know the material. Sam and Chris do as well. And so I guess the point is that it's really evident to me when somebody has taken their time with the material. And that's what I really want. And that doesn't just translate into word count. I mean, I see really good, really solid responses that are 350 words. I see responses that are way too short, and I'm thinking that's our problem. We didn't, there's a lot more to say here, and that's usually what I will offer as feedback. But it's not always about length. It's about being concrete and being complete.
So our final topic for this segment, the exam is on Tuesday. Or excuse me, the exam is on Wednesday, July 5th? Or Tuesday, July 3rd.
Yes,
Tuesday, July 3rd.
July 3rd.
It is starts at 3 p.m. and goes to 7 p.m. So you can start anytime in that window. Yep. You have 75 minutes.
But remember, once you start, it's started.
Right. So the clock starts ticking there.
Do a few, go light a sparkler and come back. No.
I think it's really helpful before you start answering, as we talked about last week, to get the lay of the land, at least look at the essay question. One thing that's helpful is sometimes if you read the essay, some people, my advice would be read the essay, write the essay right away. Others, read the essay, then go do the other stuff, but you have that essay question spinning in your head, and you can that can help you think about things as you're doing the other parts of the exam.
Or read the essay and go jot some notes really quick.
Yep.
Just go jot, here's what if I almost sometimes say to myself, if I only had 2 minutes, what would be the things I would put out there, so that then you can come back and you almost have created a little bit of a casual outline of sorts.
Yep. Yeah. And have your resources ready, but also have your resources ready, because the books in front of you aren't going to be enough.
It's just too much. Yep. You can't approach it like sitting down to write some kind of research paper and you've got everything around. No, you really do have to go into it with a strategy and already familiar, or at least I guess you don't have to do that, but that would be the best advice.
And then when you're done with the exam, you have the next day off, the 4th of July, so you can enjoy that. Well, we're going to be grading exams.
This is true.
You can enjoy that. You can talk at your barbecue about Augustine. I think people will like that. We're going to be right back with one of my favorite games that we play.
All right, well, welcome back, everybody. We are playing a new game this week that you have not seen yet. This is your favorite.
It's my favorite.
I think so. And so this is called Food Chain. So what happens in Food Chain is that Sam and I have each selected from our mastery terms 5 terms that we think are the most significant to the story of the course. So keeping in mind, we're not speaking to history broadly. Rather, we are speaking about who or what were the most significant terms from the unit as they relate to the story of the course in particular. So when we are done with this, you are going to vote on who you think has the better list here and who has sort of made the better argument. This is an awesome way to help review your vocabulary. So again, this is not just for our benefit, but this is for you to help you review. So I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So in my top position, I am going to place Homer. Number 1, I'm doing this because Homer is one of Professor Mulberry's favorite figures in history, and if you think about our course, we tie it all back to Homer. Homer's always the first on the timeline. That's always one of my favorite orienting tips for you. But when we think about Homer's writing and what Homer's poetry and what comes out of Homer is essentially what lays the basis for all of Greek culture in terms of what's going to be identified as values. How do we think about this notion of virtue? How do we think about things like brotherhood? And I'm going to say brotherhood because there's not a whole lot in there about women's roles. But in terms of actually producing a body of literature that shapes all aspects of a culture and gives people something to aspire to, that this is what gets held up as here's the type of people that we want to be. Here's the type of society that we want to be. There's nothing in Greek culture that's of significance that doesn't get tied back to Homer. So that's my first choice right there. So, I do my whole thing. Okay, sorry. I thought we went back and forth, but I guess not. I seem to remember that from last year. All right, my next one, and how could I not choose, number 1, a philosopher? But if you want to harken back to last week, I still want to make the case that Plato is probably the most significant of the Greek philosophers. So I need my Plato. Ever since we had that conversation last week, it comes up for me all the time. It came up in our discussion in the first segment of today's webisode, but I've actually thought about it a couple of times since Sam and I had the debate last week. But Plato, who lays the foundation for building on the teachings of his teacher, Socrates, putting Socrates' philosophy into writing, as we know that's all attributed to Plato's sort of synthesis of his teacher Socrates' ideas, and then laying this foundation for the ways in which we need to start to think about how do we define truth, how do we define virtue, how do we find these things, what's our role in terms of the relationship between the individual and the greater society or with the state. So Plato is my chosen philosopher.
And we'll actually go with your route, and I'll jump in and I'll do my top 2, and we'll go from there. So actually my number 1 is Plato. So I'm going to echo a lot of what you just said there. I think to look at Unit 1, I think the philosophers kind of dominate. I actually think the philosophers kind of dominate this course, philosophers and theologians.
Well, this unit. Well, the course,
I think the course as a whole, because I think a lot of the history of Christianity is the history of ideas.
This is true, but I'm hoping our philosopher friends are not watching this.
I don't
like how much you're inflating them.
But I think Plato is just such a monumental figure. And I'm not even going to say anything more about him, but my second person is going to, in some ways, point to Plato, which is, I think, number 2 on my list is Augustine.
Okay.
Who is Platonic, right? So he's going to be using Plato's philosophy to talk about Christianity. Augustine, we keep talking about how important he is. He shapes so much of the early church, but he's even more important going forward. Well, in the next unit, we're going to be talking about the Middle Ages, medieval Christianity. He's going to be the guy who sets the foundations for all of that.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm going to agree with all of that. Pause. Come back to Augustine later, because I just sort of thought about my list. I kind of worked through timeline type of way going down through history. So the next person I'm going to put up here, is Paul the Apostle. So I think about the role of Paul. Paul is tied to, if we want to think about like Augustus Caesar, the period of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, laying the foundation for the world into which Christianity is going to be born and to grow. And a significant part of that growth has to do with the fact that there is a relative period of stability and peace within the Roman Empire, making it safe to travel, making it safe for increased commerce and trade and human movement to take place. And that that relates to the role of missionary work for Christians in the post-Christ era. And the most significant Christian missionary that we have is the Apostle Paul. So we look at the prolific writings of Paul in the New Testament. We look particularly at Paul's ability to speak to audiences in a way that related to their particular culture. So to me, it's like Paul is Christianity in Western culture, because Paul is always speaking and preaching and writing letters that point to things that mattered in the culture, values people had in the culture, sometimes pushing against those, making people think about them, but always relating to them, always working with what would be familiar to people, whether that was people at the highest levels of society or people who were underprivileged and at the lowest levels, people like slaves, people like women. So Paul the Apostle.
Speaking of people like women, number 3 on my list is Perpetua.
Yep.
Perpetua,
the woman in Unit 1.
Perpetua, both for who she is specifically, but also for what she represents. And what she represents is this sort of new birth of Christianity, right? And especially martyrdom, right? And this is not, so she's important because she's a woman. She's also important because she's a martyr. Yeah. Tertullian says the seeds of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, right? So her story is important because it is hers, but it's also important because it's a common story in early Christianity. People who say, I take my faith very seriously, and I'm going to stand up for my faith, and if that means laying down my life, that's the best expression of Christianity. So I think we don't have the growth in the early church before the time of Constantine without people like Perpetua. So I think she, as a representative of the movement of martyrdom, is just unbelievably important.
I like what you said about Perpetua too, because I think it's also about the reconceptions of family that are identified in Christianity. And I think when I was I'm going off on a tangent, but I think when I was a kid, when I would learn that no, you're family is in Christ first, that kind of freaked me out. It was like, what does that mean? But what it actually means is to bring a level of comfort, especially in a society where it's patriarchal, it's hierarchical, and what Christ was trying to do was to say, we're equals here. You are the inheritors of a rich tradition. You are the inheritors of the reward that is coming, regardless of gender, regardless of economic status, regardless of social status.
Can't wait to see what you have next.
Yeah, I know, because I'm making your argument for you. So then I put Constantine. And again, part of me just doesn't ever like to elevate the role of Constantine, but it would be ridiculous not to, because what we see is the significant shift from Christianity in the midst of an empire where it is persecuted, where it has to figure out how to continue, how to survive despite real and legitimate strategic efforts on the part of the state to stamp it out, to be suspicious of it. And then we see this shift to what happens to Christianity when you have an emperor who is friendly towards it. Again, remembering Constantine doesn't make it the state religion. It becomes legalized, though, under Constantine. We know this story of the battle at the Milvian Bridge. Constantine obviously believes something's going on there. There's some kind of power in Christianity. But what we see is this shift for now, instead of a bottom-up movement within Christianity, it becomes top down. And so now it becomes privileged, actually. And so what I think is why I think that's so significant is regardless of where you are in the world or where your roots to Christianity are tied, even if it's not through the Western tradition, like when Christianity comes to Latin America eventually, and that's a whole difficult story, but it's Western Christianity because of like what Constantine has set up.
Absolutely. And I like this idea of, thinking about how Constantine shifts the orientation of Christianity from the bottom up to the top down. My next person focuses on that bottom up part still.
Yeah.
And that is Anthony. And Anthony is unbelievably important to me. Again, part of these are looking forward, because as we'll see in the Middle Ages, monasticism is going to take on new forms and is going to become arguably the most important Christian institution of the Middle Ages. So Anthony is rethinking martyrdom in a post-Constantinian world to say, well, what does it mean before and then after Constantine, what does it mean to live a life where Christianity is accepted, but to still take those teachings of Christ really seriously, really literally, and to call this into question? Yeah. So I like the fact that we have these two together, because there's a tension here that I think shapes a lot of the debates of this course and a lot of the debates of Christianity that have been at its core from the very beginnings.
Yes. All right. So the next person that I am going to choose, I'm going to take some issues with this one, but I'm going to wait till we're all done here, is Augustine, whichever one you want to go with. Number one, Augustine functions as this hinge figure for us, as Sam just commented, kind of trying to think ahead. We know it's a little bit difficult because it's things you may not know yet, but Augustine is he's got like a foot in Unit 1 and a foot in Unit 2, and he's going to sort of like, with City of God, he's going to hold our hands and help shepherd us through sort of the stability of the past into the instability of the future, and sort of try to give us a lifeline, which is going to be the way we need to view Christianity, or the way that we need to think about like God's activity in the world. And so Augustine, like the most prolific writer, Christian writer, certainly of, one of the most prolific writers in all of Christian history, which is remarkable when you think about the time and the context. As we mentioned in the first segment, the questions that Augustine raises, the debates that he challenges, the ideas that he tries to flesh out, are questions we're still wrestling with today. They're not things that are settled, and we still look to him and we still look to his ideas to help us think about what does this mean for now. But as I said, ultimately, he does function as this image of somebody who faith is intellectual and study is rigorous. It's intellectual, but it's also deeply personal. And at the end of the day, you can understand all of this maybe even at a much higher level. But if it isn't actually shaping who you are, how you feel about yourself, the idea of what does it mean if you think you truly are like a bearer of God's image, then what does any of that other stuff matter? And to me, that's something I've come more so to appreciate about him.
And at the bottom of my list, I am putting another philosopher. I'm going to put Aristotle here.
You kind of went, I did not see this
strategy. I talked about Aristotle in our last webisode, and although that was the hand I was dealt, and I probably like Plato more, he's the top of my list. I do actually mean most of what I said, everything I said about Aristotle in terms of how important he is. When you look at the Western world, today the Western world is a world where we view the world scientifically. Now, it's not Aristotelian science, but Aristotle is pushing for a more scientific understanding of the world, at least a physical understanding of the world. And I think these two sort of titans of philosophy are unbelievably important, whether you're a Christian or not, but they both play major roles in Christianity. We're going to see Aristotle's role, again, in the Middle Ages. All of my things are pointing forward.
Yes.
But I think if we're thinking about really who are the most important people, the most important figures we looked at, I really think I want to have him on this list.
Okay, yeah. I like your list. The only one I want to think of as well, I think these two are a little bit obscure. I love Perpetua. Usually Perpetua would make it into my list, again, because we have so few women's voices. Doesn't mean they were there, but the ways in which we actually get to encounter them can be really tricky, and that in of itself is, I think, a big lesson and a big learning moment that we need to pay attention to. However, with Anthony here, my issue always with like the early desert fathers, the monastics, I'm not saying that like monasticism wasn't interesting or good. However, at this point in history, both its geographic context as well as what's happening in the social context, this is a privileged person. Like, this is not being a monastic because people were persecuting you. This is not being a monastic because, like, you were poor and had nothing else. This is a privileged person who, I mean, good cause. Like, I don't like what's happening in the world. I don't like that Christianity has become too easy. I want to go out and draw a contrast to myself. But, like, this is somebody who got all their ducks in a row and made sure that their sister was financially taken care of before they then went out and made the choice to live in the particular position they did. I'm not saying that isn't, like, a cool and admirable thing, but I will say it's hard for me a little bit to get away from the fact that, like this is not, for me, a model of Christianity. Like, it's not, if everybody was doing this, like, how would we be moving the community forward? How would we be bringing about change? Like, what is this model doing to actually lift up those that are at the margins, or those that are, like, the weak and the powerless? So that's my only issue there.
Because Constantine did such a good job of that.
But you could actually make the argument, I don't like Constantine, but you could make the argument that legalization actually sure did a whole lot more than what this individual choice does.
But you could talk about the reason that I have him on there is because he also serves as a kind of prophetic voice, needing to call out what's happening here. I mean, that's why I think when I think about the importance of monasticism, a lot of it has to do with monasticism going forward. We'll see in Unit 2. But these are the voices who are saying this stuff people are getting excited about, celebrating, these changes that are happening in the church. Somebody needs to find a way to make people aware of the fact that there's maybe a problem here. And you can't say they're just going out in the desert and shouting at no one. He's a famous person for doing this.
I understand that.
The story of his life that Athanasius writes becomes a really significant, important book.
And
Augustine
a
is
stellar
reading the book.
Read. No,
I think needing to have that voice in contrast to these radical changes that are happening. So if we're thinking about importance, I think this is unbelievably important. And as this person of privilege, I mean, he is doing what he can to renounce that. Now you can say, okay, well, what good did that do? Well, what does he do when they sell the estate, besides maybe taking care of his sister? He's following Christ, saying, give it to the poor and come follow me. This is his understanding of what it means to live that life. Now, we can question that here or there. Perpetua, you didn't really argue that much with Perpetua.
No.
But, again, I think martyrdom is deeply significant. She's the example we have of that.
I'm just saying that when I think about, like, this is about within the context of the course. Love these people. This one, I feel like, again, it's not like I'm a big fan of his, but understanding the ripple effect on what is coming forward to me, it's like I got to have him in there, whether I like him or not.
Sure. So. And I have to say, I mean, looking at yours, like, it killed me that you took Homer, because I felt like, I don't know if I want to take Homer then, because I want to talk about some of these other folks. But I think he's unbelievably important. I obviously agree with you on Plato and Augustine. Paul's kind of a no-brainer. I mean, I feel like you kind of picked the dream team a little bit.
I'm sorry. That's what I mean. I'm not choosing.
You're going to win, right?
Well, I'm trying to teach.
That's right, and so am I.
Okay. So do not forget to vote for who you feel, but I shouldn't say who won food chain. Which list
is
makes
better.
More sense?
Yeah.
We
and
can
who
take
won?
the personal.
There's winning. Come on, there's.
I know.
Winning.
Well, there is, but again, you and
I don't care who wins. I just want there to be a winner.
Now I know. Okay, you choose. All right. Well, welcome back to our final segment. It's happy time.
That makes me happy.
Makes me happy. Makes me real happy. Makes Dr. Garrett's feel okay. But happy birthday, first of all, July 2nd, to Walmart, whose first store opened this day in 1962. Which state, you ask? I bet a lot of people probably know.
It's Arkansas.
Yeah, it's Arkansas. Sam, when you retire from Bethel, what are the odds you'll work as a greeter at Walmart?
It's so funny if this question were asked to me or to you. There's never, ever would I do this.
No.
I'm a socially anxious person to begin with, so the thought of having a job whose not only the primary function, but the only function is to talk to people that I don't know. Like, I'm the last.
Yeah,
this is not the face you want to see when you walk into Walmart.
No, I wouldn't want this job either, though. That is not. I am not in Walmart all that often. Walmart actually really stresses me out. I don't like who I am when I'm at Walmart or preparing to go there. But whenever I walk in and the smiling people greeter greets you, my response, I kind of want to be like, I'm sorry. Like, I'm sorry. This is what you're doing. I'm sorry it's come to this. Wow. Even if they seem excited about it. You know what's ironic is the last time I was in Walmart was July 2nd, of 2017 last year, because July 2nd is also my son Luke's birthday. So, yeah, so happy birthday to Luke as well, who is 10 today, which is pretty exciting.
You going to take him to Walmart next year?
No.
Oh, okay.
And if I plan ahead better, I won't need to go to Walmart on July 2nd anymore.
Happy anniversary to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed this day by Lyndon Johnson, with Martin Luther King right behind him, 1 year after he was in the Birmingham jail. We're not going to riff on this, but this is a pretty landmark moment in American history.
It's funny because I feel conflicted, just sort of being a downer about Walmart's birthday, and then we have something that's actually really important. So, on the one hand, I suppose for some people, 1964 seems like a very long time ago, and even though you and I were born in the 70s, this is historically really new. I mean, this is like yesterday in terms of history. It's not even yesterday; it's a couple hours ago. If we wanted to,
yeah, I mean, we were born 13 years after this, which is insane.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yes, which is crazy, but no, so significant. Kind of helps us think about rooting the course a little bit more and understanding the contemporary applications. Something that I enjoy in teaching the Civil Rights Act. I mostly just talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the environmental history course that I teach, but helping students understand this was not that long ago, and to understand actually many of the ways in which there were forms of both formal and informal discrimination that I don't often think about, things like fair housing practices, things about employment law, and things like that truly generationally put people at a disadvantage. And so this is huge, and I don't think it's all fixed or it's all solved. So it's something that we do need to continue to not see as done, but rather we need to function like this has just passed.
Right.
I think.
Right.
Yeah. And finally, happy trails. Goodbye, Unit 1. Goodbye, Unit 1. Be honest, Sam, where does this unit rank when we think of the 3 units?
That's tough.
Understanding. Don't ruin Unit 2 or Unit 3.
I
Don't give it away.
I will say, I kind of feel like I'm obligated to say it's my favorite, in that when we teach this course in the regular semester, I do 3 or 4 lectures in Unit 1.
So you're heavy Unit 1.
I kind of love, I really love the ancient world. I really love the early church, the Roman Empire era. So I kind of love that, but then I feel like I'm not being fair to the Middle Ages, which are going to be great. It's gonna be great going forward too. So
yeah,
by the end of Unit 2 will be my favorite unit.
Well, that's a cool thing. Unit 1 isn't my favorite, so I'm just gonna own that. Okay. Yeah, no,
what's your favorite?
Unit 2 and Unit 3, each in their own respected ways. Wow. But maybe I'm kind of like you. It's we get to it, and then I'm like, oh, this is my favorite, But no, and maybe it's because exactly the same reasons, just different unit. In the regular semester, I teach quite a bit in Unit 2, and then kind of wrap some things up in Unit 3, and so there's certain things in Unit 2. I like Unit 1, but there's certain things in Unit 2 I get really excited about. And so, yeah, so for me, the best is yet to come.
There we go. And for you, the best is yet to come.
That's so true. That's so true. Don't think it's over. It's not. Right. It's only going to get better.
So good luck on your exam. Have a great 4th of July.
Yes,
please email us if you have questions. We try to be kind of around when online when you're taking the exam, but we can't really answer exam questions while you're taking it. So make sure you're really ready to go when you hit start. Yeah. And it's going to be great. Take your time. Don't rush it.
Right. And to just as some reminders as we close out here, there's no discussion post tomorrow. So you get to sort of take some time off, enjoy a couple of days off. But please do not forget to vote for who you think is the winner of Food Chain. Because, you and I will be up all night watching those results come in.
It's like election.
It is exactly like elections, and keeping our families up. And I won't be able to have a good 4th of July, I think, until I just kind of know where I stand.
Okay. So, well, that's the end of the webisode. We always struggle with what to say at the end. And since Dr. Geertz is gone, I always have this question for him, which is, because he's not actually in the same time zone as us. So what time is it for you, Dr. Geertz?
Yeah.